Hello, everyone. I'm Victoria Main, CEO at SEC Newgate EU. Welcome to our latest Brussels Calling media panel. This one's dedicated to the horrific war in Ukraine, which is costing countless lives. Truth is also a casualty, as we'll hear during the discussion. We're honored to have EU Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevičius as moderator. Lithuanian with a Ukrainian wife, he was the first and perhaps the only commissioner to visit Ukraine after the Russian invasion. So he'll be drawing on both personal and professional experience when moderating today's panel. Before becoming Commissioner of Environment, Oceans and Fisheries in 2019, Mr. Sinkevičius was Lithuanian Minister of Economy and Innovation. Now, here's a fun fact. In a previous life, he was a writer and editor for the Lithuania Tribune, an English language portal for Lithuanians abroad. So he does have some ink in his veins. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our diverse panel who will provide different angles on the war and its consequences. We have Vlad Makszimov, who covers Central and Eastern European affairs for EURACTIV. When war broke out, Vlad was visiting family in Russia, where he was born, so he had a mad dash back to Brussels. He's actually currently in Hungary, covering the elections there. Jennifer Rankin has been The Guardian's correspondent here for more than 6 years. She's written for Reuters, the Irish Times, the Moscow Times, the Scotsman, the Independent, the Economist, and for 4 years was a staffer at European Voice. So Jennifer's a real fixture on the Brussels media scene. Simon Townsley is an internationally acclaimed photographer, twice named British Press Photographer of the Year and winner of numerous other awards. He has just spent a month in Ukraine covering the war for the Telegraph. Another fun fact, Simon and I began our media careers together quite some time ago in Wellington, New Zealand. Now for some housekeeping. The session is recorded and will be posted online, and do feel free to tweet using the Brussels Calling hashtag. Enough of me, over to you, Commissioner, to set the scene and launch the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and of course, good afternoon to everyone. It's not often, I would say it's probably the first time that I'm actually in the seat, not on the opposite chair where I have to answer the questions, participating in discussions, but I will have to moderate. And absolutely thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for all the speakers, of course, who agreed to participate. I hope we'll have a lively discussion because, I think it is very important to keep such discussions flowing, because at the moment the war is entering its almost fifth week. So there is definitely a war fatigue. Information fatigue among society, and I think this is always a very dangerous thing, because at the moment how I see situation with negotiations ongoing and certain messages from Russia, I always say that you don't listen what Russians are saying, but you look what they're doing, and the actions unfortunately do not really correspond to words. And when I see that only today, tonight, there were 50 missiles launched on Kharkiv, I really have big skepticism regarding the negotiations, because if you look historically, usually, first of all, there is a ceasefire and then terms negotiated. Now, the methodology which is chosen is completely opposite. And I don't really know if that really going to lead to result. Of course, we all hope, but the situation on the ground is very bad. It is extremely poor in Mariupol. Maybe the shine of hope that seems like some ceasefire is agreed for today, and Kiev is sending buses to evacuate people. Hopefully that operation will succeed, But overall, I think we are at the moment far from the peace settlement. The war is raging, and I think that, you know, having also this sort of personal attachment, getting lots of information from the ground, I think such discussions are very timely to, as I said, continue talking, looking for possible solutions, and not leaving Ukrainians alone, because I think Ukrainians are fighting for European values, first of all. They are the ones now to really defending what our values are. And if war takes different turn, it will be also a humiliation and a loss, not to brave Ukrainian peoples, but it will be the humiliation and a loss to Western world, that we didn't manage to support Ukrainians enough. But that's a short intro from myself to set the scene. I will be very happy to listen to all of you. And I would like to begin let's say, to that lecture. I don't know if you have seen the famous Putin speech about history. I mean, for me, being from, you know, from Eastern Europe, hearing that basically Lenin created Ukraine was the biggest nonsense I ever heard for many, many years, speaking about the history. But I'm very curious, and this is the question which I want to talk to all of you, to warm up, so that, you know, historical and cultural aspects in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. In his lecture, Putin pushed this narrative that historic relations between Russia and Ukraine are difficult. Ukraine is not even a country. He sort of tried to push that narrative. Ukrainians are not a nation, and etc. So for foreign press, how do you perceived it, and sort of, you know, what level of manipulation you think it is? I'm very curious to hear, and I would suggest that we start with Jennifer, and then maybe Vlad and Simon.
Well, thanks again for inviting me to join this terrific panel, and it's a great question. For me, as someone who's been interested in Russia for a very long time, I'm familiar with the narratives that Russian state media use, and the belittling of Ukraine and the other former Soviet parts of the Soviet Union as not proper countries. And I think maybe you saw something similar in 2008 in Georgia as well. And while I'm not claiming to know that, I'm not claiming to sort of feel the cultural history as richly as someone who is from Ukraine or from the Baltic states, I was nevertheless impressed when I was in Kiev now more than 10 years ago to visit some of the very ancient churches and monasteries that are there that I remember being told at the time predated Moscow by several hundred years. So this narrative, the Russian narrative is familiar to me as someone who's followed Russian state media. I interviewed Margarita Simonyan 10 years ago when Russia Today was still relatively new. It's now was rebranded as RT, and now of course it cannot be watched in the EU as part of the sanctions policy. But I suppose maybe more broadly, and it's taken us a while in the West to catch up, and RT until recently was broadcast in the EU. In the country I know best, in the UK, we saw a lot of politicians going on RT, and they were maybe not, I think, quite happy just to air sort of domestic controversies that allowed, that were quite useful for the Kremlin to sort of show the West as chaotic and disorganized, while not actually ever discussing any internal dissent in Russia itself.
Very well. I really like your point about going to such television. I think that has to be done, really thinking through what will be the end of the picture that is shown, and sometimes we miss that. Thank you very much. Vlad, maybe you could join. Have you seen the Putin's lecture? And I guess as you speak language as I do, you could watch it in original language.
Yeah, I have seen, in fact, this lecture, and I don't claim to be an historian. That is not my job, so I'm not going to be disputing. Obviously, it was used to construct a narrative for domestic audiences. I think in this question, I sort of wear a double hat because I was born in Russia. My family is Russian. And I went to a Russian school, and I got to read some of the Russian history books as a kid. And so the sort of some of the Russian birth mythology of the Russian state is very closely tied to Ukraine. That wasn't invented by Putin. That has been around for a very long time. Now, how, as I said, obviously this narrative then, though, was used to legitimize Kremlin's politics and for the past at least a decade, even more for Russian audiences. But just speaking from my own family's experience, I don't think it really hit home until the invasion of Crimea in particular, because there was a lot of historical revisionism in Russian society, particularly attached to Crimea. And I think that was used as an anchoring point then to expand these narratives further and further in Ukraine, to the point where Ukraine was not even a country or a nation, that didn't have a right to exist anymore. So this is sort of from the Russian perspective. And then from, I think from a foreign press perspective, I think there was a lot of whataboutism, particularly, and not mainstream parts of discourse and especially leftist discourse in press when it comes to colonialism and the inability of some European countries to face its past. So it was almost Russia's narratives denying the statehood, Ukrainian statehood and nationhood, were legitimized by, well, we didn't face our own colonial past. They're just trying to do that for themselves as well. So I think the complexity of the issue was used as a forefront to then legitimize what Putin was saying in this very peculiar lecture of his.
Thank you. Simon, would you like to react on that lecture and Putin's speech briefly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting tactic to say, well, Ukraine isn't a country, and to try to delegitimize anybody who is Ukrainian or speaks Ukrainian or considers themselves Ukrainian. And I think, like most dictators or leaders of invading armies, it really works very well for you if you can dehumanize the people that you're asking your soldiers to execute, to shell, to kill. And I mean, I think it's very complex for somebody like Putin, who at the same time is claiming to be a liberator of Ukraine, so that's slightly schizophrenic, but certainly, you only have to be on the ground for a few minutes to realize that, it's clearly a country that's has a very rich heritage and consequently has all of the characteristics of a nation. I mean, it's preposterous to even suggest anything else. So one of the things that struck me while I was driving around, and something that I learned a great deal about when I was growing up, as the legacy of the early 20th century, was the number of people that we were told Hitler had killed. And then almost as an afterthought, people said, but of course, Stalin killed a lot more in Ukraine. And it's very, very clear, the memorials to the awful state-created famine are all over the country. And that is, to move slightly into the next stage of this conversation, I mean, that is giving people a reason to fight. And if you're a Ukrainian who's seen what what Russian-sponsored political activity has done to your country in the past, you're just not going to. You've got nowhere to go. You're going to fight. So I think it's going to play against them in the end.
You know, thank you very much all for your excellent answers. You know, I would say one more thing. You know, what drawing those historical sort of conclusions and sort of trying to do that delegitimization of Ukraine. One thing which Putin, I think, is very afraid in his neighborhood is a prosperous democratic country. That's something that can kill his regime in the long run. And the most, because look, Ukraine has democratic elections. Yes, it's imperfect. There is a lot of internal battles and so on, but that's absolutely normal for a democracy. And, you know, I think the most what he is really afraid is a prosperous Ukraine, democratic Ukraine, and that the Russians see this big difference. I always said that the moment Belarusians will see how Lithuanians prosper and live, there will be uneasy times for Lukashenko, and this is what happening. But moving now, Simon, you did an excellent job, and really thank you very much for reporting from the ground. That's a very dangerous mission, but very important one for people to see what's really going on. 12 colleagues of yours already, you know, died in Ukraine. That's really is just showing how dangerous it is, and that the level of aggression is immense. Could you maybe tell a couple words to the audience how you felt on the ground? What were the conditions? Which regions you have visited? From where you reported? Where was the most dangerous that you felt?
Sure. Yeah. So we went in initially, we crossed the Polish border and drove to Lviv and spent a day there, and then headed east from there to Vinnytsia, which is about, well, the timing's changed a lot now, of course, but it took about 7 hours to get there, going through checkpoints. When we got to Vinnytsia, we made a call on where we would go next, and there was a great threat to Odessa, so we chose to go, perhaps unwisely, to Odessa. And from Odessa, we went down to Mykolaiv, and then we drove back around to Zaporizhia through Dnipro. So we covered quite a lot of the countryside, and I was very lucky. I mean, through most of that time, we had a few jets passing low. There was a certain amount of outgoing activity. There was a little bit of shelling, but in fact, not shelling, but rocket attacks. We weren't really in shelling range. So we managed to cover the war in a way that I wasn't expecting. And that was very interesting, because in fact, we weren't really covering a war, we're covering a story. It's bigger than the war. I think it's really important that we all, you know, recognize that it's about the destabilization of the planet, really, in so many different ways. So, you know, if you want to cover the conflict and only the conflict, then you're putting yourself at great risk. If everything you see has to be under combat condition, then depending on how close you are, you expose yourself to different types of attacks, and the closer you get, the more personal they are. So if you're being shelled, you don't necessarily take that personally. If somebody's shooting at you, and I covered Bosnia and Sarajevo, being shot at is a very personal experience, not one I want to follow up.
Right. Thank you very much for your answer. Vlad, I would like to ask you a question. You know, I have many stories from my friends in Ukraine, because as you said, you know, Ukrainians are closely associated to Russians, and I think despite the effort what Putin tried to sort of call them Nazis and whatever, it's impossible to prove to Russian people that Ukrainians are not close to them, and many of them because they have relatives and family in Russia. But what I heard is terrible stories when people from Kiev, people from Kharkiv, Lviv, calling their families, relatives to Russia and saying that, you know, the war started and Russians attacking us, and the relatives don't believe it, and they say it's all nonsense. Stop believing your government. Stop believing Zelenskyy. We are here to liberate you, and all that. All that rubbish from the Russian propaganda box. You also visited your family just before the war break out, and of course you keep close relations with your family. What are they saying, and what are the close friends of them are saying about the situation in Ukraine?
Yes, I think what Simon was saying, that, you know, this narrative is used to dehumanize Ukrainians, is a very important point, and I think that's precisely what's happening. My own family, I'll start with the story of my own family and try to draw some lessons from there. They are staunchly anti-Putin. So I come from an industrial town in the middle of Siberia called Bratsk. It's a relatively small, big regional city, but small by every other standard, and very poor. And my family has blamed Putin for robbing Siberia of all of its rich resources. So they're far from supporters of the Kremlin. And when the war broke out, you know, there was disbelief, not understanding what is happening, why is this happening, what is the point. And like many other Russians, I also have distant family in Ukraine, actually in Donetsk and Luhansk, right on the border. They actually were split after the attempts to secede. And that is what I was experiencing when the war broke out. Talking to my family now, a month into the war, I'm starting to hear, you know, not support for Putin and not support for the war, but some of the, you know, of the propaganda seeping through. Oh, but, you know, there's a second side that needs to be listened to. But, you know, well, what about the nationalists in Russia? And, you know, I need to start asking myself these questions. How is this possible? And I think for me, the answer is, well, you know, people are experiencing cognitive dissonance between the fact that the war has such a high cost, which they experience on themselves, and that it being completely pointless, at least to them on the ground. So one of these things needs to go, and I think what a lot of people are going for, well, there has to be a point. And what's even more scary, I've mentioned my distant family in Ukraine. Actually, that distant family is split along generational lines. So the younger generation that lived in Kiev has now managed to escape to France, thankfully, and they're safe. But the older generation decided to stay back, and they experienced shelling. They stayed in a bunker for a week, and they were telling my family back in Russia and Siberia, "Thank God the Russians are coming to liberate us." So if the propaganda is working even on the people who are being shelled in Luhansk and Donetsk, we really must start asking ourselves, how are we getting this messaging so wrong, and what can we start doing differently?
Yeah, I mean, shocking. What you have said, it's really shocking, because it only proves that propaganda intensifies, most likely, with the war. So then there is, of course, additional pictures which can be shown, and this is what the Russians, of course, are doing, how they bringing humanitarian aid, and how brutal is Ukrainian army, and so on. And, you know, to fight propaganda, I think this is big our disadvantage against them, because they know how to construct propaganda. They've been doing that for many years. And to fight propaganda, you either have to, you know, have your propaganda, or there is no good ways to fight it, especially when now the access to all the channels is closed, and all the Russian bloggers who would have, you know, different opinions, they basically are cut off. Let's return a bit back to Brussels. Jennifer, I have a question for you. You know, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy now is widely called the leader of the Western world. How do you think important has Zelenskyy's direct appeal to EU decision makers has been in swaying their response?
I think his interventions have been remarkable, and this is such a feature of this conflict, that you've had these extremely powerful speeches from Zelenskyy that have been broadcast often in real time, and we can follow all his addresses to the parliaments of the world, to the European Parliament, and then not many hours after it happened, to the EU Council last week. And I think one of the most powerful surely must be on the very day that war broke out, when he addressed that EU summit in Brussels, and he told the leaders, you might not see me again, because he was, I mean, rightly, as we hear from all the intelligence, in fear of his life. And I think that was really an extraordinary moment, and we can only speculate, but it must have really weighed in leaders' minds as they decided what the consequences would be. And then very quickly we saw sanctions, and we saw the decision to fund lethal aid to Ukraine, and we saw Germany's decision to not go ahead to freeze Nord Stream, and all these big decisions happened all so quickly. And I'm sure that must have been a factor of hearing Zelensky's words ringing in their ears. And then I found his address last week to the EU summit, again, incredibly powerful. We didn't watch it in real time, but it was broadcast a few hours later. And there you had him address each EU country in turn, so almost not exactly giving them marks out of 10, but saying, you know, to say, Lithuania, you're with us, and or, you know, France, you could be doing better. And then this really very personal statement about Hungary as well, to Viktor Orban, you've got to choose a side. You've got to, you know, do you know what's happening in Mariupol? And I just watched that, and it really, I mean, it was just an extraordinary moment. It just sends a sort of shiver down your spine to just hear these really powerful words. So I think he's a remarkable war leader, and probably very few people. I mean, maybe it was unfair. He was perhaps written off as in the West as being a sort of, he was always referred to as a comedian, when in fact he had probably a more varied acting career than many people realized. But he went on to find reserves of leadership that I think very few people, certainly in the West, had expected.
I fully agree with you. I mean, all of his speeches were tailor-made to the audience, you know, finding the way to their hearts. And this is what he was able to do. And I think, you know, overall, a lot of people use that as him sort of being a comedian. But, you know, I think to write a good joke, you have to have a high IQ. So that make people laugh. You cannot write a good joke, you know, without really thinking it through and appealing to people. And his background definitely helps to do that appeal. But of course, I think naturally he has this bravery, which we all feel even on video, you know, watching him, which is very, very inspiring. Thank you very much for your answer. Simon, I will have a question to you. You know, very difficult thing is to stay neutral, because definitely, you know, while you're reporting on war where you very well know, you know, the war is on the Ukrainian soil. We know who attacked, who started this act of aggression, and that innocent people of Ukraine, men and women, children die every day. How you know stay on that neutral reporting side? You have a deep experience with Yugoslavia as well. You named it, with Bosnia. Could you share, please?
Okay, so for me, you don't have to remain neutral in order to be neutral. You know, I spent time listening to the stories of people who'd fled Mariupol. I spent time photographing children who'd been shelled and shot. One girl who was 11 years old and was shot in the face by the Russians. So That is a fact. I mean, it's just a fact. 1 minute she's with her family and, you know, she was a promising gymnast, and then now she, you know, she's too scared to get up and walk, and, you know, she has a bullet through her face. So maybe she'll come right, maybe she won't. But the question isn't, you know, about being neutral. What human can be neutral? I mean, that's just wrong. And the reality is that Russians did that. So if I found a Ukrainian who'd done that, I'd tell you about it. So the problem is that we can only see one side of the conflict. And again, you know, it kind of backfires on Putin. If you don't let journalists on the other side and you're saying what we're doing is right and true, well, let us see it. You know, truth doesn't survive. You know, truth only survives if it's let out. You know, there is no truth in the darkness. So you can only show what you're allowed to see. And in the case of being neutral, I think, you know, it's very difficult, you know, if you're only allowed on one side. You know, I have to say that Ukrainians are fiercely loyal and naturally enough, I mean, they're under attack, so they're very nervous about criticism. And I think that's something we have to guard against as things go on. We have to be prepared to criticize. And right now, perhaps is a more difficult time, but we shouldn't shy away from things that we might discover in the future. And you mentioned earlier, Commissioner, that, you know, it's not a country that's been a stranger to corruption. And we have to call that out. You know, we can't move forward with a partner who we believe in if we can't be straight with them. But neutrality and facts, you know, well, they're two separate things.
Excellent answer. Thank you very much, and thank you, of course, for sharing that personal touch on the story. I started at the beginning speaking about the dangerous thing, war fatigue, and I would like to ask both, you know, Vlad and later Jennifer. Second month of the war started. Do you feel war fatigue in the work of media? Does the attention from Ukraine starting to slip onto other topics, Vlad?
I think the modes of covering Ukraine have shifted. You know, I think when the war started, it was all hands on deck. There was just, especially, you know, newsrooms operate with a set amount of resources. So it was all hands on deck on trying to cover everything that was coming in. You know, obviously we are a media focused on the European angle, so we try to do that from the point of the view of the EU and what the EU was doing. I think moving from just covering what is happening on the ground, we have now moved to treating the war in Ukraine as one of the angles to every story, the same way we have, you know, the European Green Deal is an angle to almost every story we write. Now, you know, the Hungarian elections have a Ukraine story, and energy story will always have a Ukraine angle as well. And so I think the mode has shifted. I think that's the perspective from our newsroom, but I'm really looking forward to hear what Jennifer says.
Good. Thank you for your answer, Jennifer.
I think I would very much share Vlad's view. I don't feel that for me personally, there isn't the same sort of intensity as on the early days of the war, when it felt as if there was nothing else that we could write about. But I think that, yeah, the mode has shifted. So now you because this has been such a seismic event, Ukraine is the lens for all sorts of stories, whether it's about energy or foreign policy. But I wouldn't say yet there is fatigue, certainly not for our readers. So I noticed just before joining this call, on our top 10 most read stories, 9 had a Ukraine angle. So there's huge demand from our readers, and it's a very international audience to know what's going on, not just the war on the ground, of course, and the humanitarian catastrophe, but also the diplomatic, the economic consequences as well?
I think, you know, overall, what I was really pleased to see, of course, so Europeans, but also I have heard this a lot from people in my friends living in UK, how actually people were united in supporting Ukraine, large donations, humanitarian aid, small thing like fleeing the flag in their yard, but I see it a lot here in Belgium. I hear that there is a lot of that in UK as well. I think this is very important details, and of course hopefully that attention and willingness to help will remain, because we haven't touched much on it, but this is the biggest since the Second World War humanitarian catastrophe and then displacement of people, which is ongoing. You know, the numbers of people migrating is large. You know, in 2015 there was a year and 1.5 million people, and the discussions went so deep that about, you know, unity in the European Union and so on. Now we have almost a million a week. So there is definitely a very important to maintain that focus and support from people, which would drive also decision makers to continuously support Ukraine's effort. I wanted to ask one more question. Maybe I'll start with you, Vlad. As an internet media, you perfectly see what your readers are interested. So is war in Ukraine really a top story from the reader's perspective, or it's more of a bubble, let's say, in certain regions?
No, it absolutely. I think Jennifer was touching on it as well. No, it absolutely is top story. Of course, then the question becomes, what angles of the war in Ukraine? Is it the actual war, the movement of the troops on the ground? I don't think that is the case for us, but mostly because also our audience are, you know, in people normally interested in EU policy and politics. So I think people who come for us then come for, you know, the Ukrainian angle on the stories that happen here in Brussels. But also, you know, I think, so for instance, you know, the revenue sources of EURACTIV are quite diverse, so we are not relying on so much on the interest in the stories to be able to cover, but I think it's also sort of our strength, because then we are able to deliver these sort of you know, smaller stories that I think, for instance, one story that is coming out today might be very interesting is the mayors that are interacting with the Committee of the Regions, such an underrepresented body normally in media coverage for many reasons. I think we'll and we've seen this, our stories about how the cohesion policy is being sort of reutilized to help Ukrainian refugees who have fled to EU member states. These stories have performed better than they usually do, which for me is a sign that no, there is a real interest in Ukraine and the consequences, especially of the war in Ukraine for Europe, for readers.
Thank you very much. We have a question from a reader, as we have around 8 minutes left, so I would like to throw it in. So the question from Ben Duncan, and it's should the European Union and its member states be doing more to counter Putin's useful idiots among the bloggers, citizens, journalists, and conspiracy theorists in Europe and in the United States? And if so, what? Maybe I'll give the floor first to Simon, but then I would like Jennifer also to answer this question, because you touched upon RT and people going there and doing a big favor for those channels. So Simon, please.
Sure. Well, thanks, Ben. I mean, boy, they really are idiots. I mean, useful or not to anybody. And that's the thing. I mean, I think it's almost immediately apparent when you listen to a lot of these, frankly, quite hysterical people, that they're not based in fact. That said, people do believe a lot of them. Now, I was working with a couple of Ukrainian journalists, and they were very keen on just stamping this out. They wanted to shut down any of these voices, and I was slightly concerned about where one draws the line between deliberate acts of misinformation and disinformation that are clearly inaccurate and just opinions that people voice that are entirely mad and unsavory and really shouldn't be given any oxygen. You know, I mean, if we talk about us being the democratic West and we talk about ourselves having, you know, shining the light of truth on things, we have to be quite careful not to just simply steamroller over anybody else's views just because we don't like them. So I think there's an incredibly difficult balance to be had there. And I'm not sure it's just as simple as shutting down social media account after social media account. We have to actively counter that with the truth that we go and find on the ground. And I mean, just to add slightly to the point you were making before, Commissioner, about whether there'll be a sort of fatigue on this. I think, you know, that journalists are going to start taking greater and greater risks to counter that fatigue. They're going to start moving closer and closer to the front. They're going to try and get into, you know, difficult cities like Mariupol to see what's going on. And so, you know, in order to sort of deal with the dangers inherent with carrying the story, I think editors and people in charge of organizations need to be a little bit careful about what they do to counteract fatigue. You know, we have to do, as Vlad said, I think, do the things that Vlad was saying, which is to frame the rest of the world's stories and look at them through the lens of Ukraine for the time being.
Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to come in on this question too?
Yeah, so just briefly, my impression is that the useful idiots are not as prominent now as they were in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, when it felt that you had sort of more of these narratives more prominently. But I think the war, the recent war, has really has maybe united Western European public opinion more than the annexation of Crimea, when you did hear people, quite a lot of people saying, oh, but it was part of Russia anyway, so let's not bother about it. Yeah, I think you heard that quite a lot in 2014, and I don't think you hear the Russian talking points echoed with such prominence today. And I think there was quite a lot of, at least, public shaming of people who had been on RT. I'm thinking, well, of the UK in particular, where you had the former leader of the Scottish opposition, who was very well paid for doing a TV show on RT, and then stepped down from that. So I thought public pressure in itself was effective. But I mean, I'm sure there's more the social media companies can do in combating factual disinformation and in stopping the accounts with clearly wrong statements, you know, ricocheting all the way around the internet. But as Simon was saying, it's a difficult line to draw when you start looking at people who might just have, when you're talking about prescribing just mad opinions. So it's not clear cut to me.
I think we might have lost the commissioner just for a second, but I might come in because Jennifer, you said something that I could really fast comment on. I think also there are unintended consequences to then trying to shut down these voices. Just yesterday, the far right, one of the far right parties in Hungary, Miha Zang, has come out with a statement that Facebook has shut down their Facebook page right before the elections. And this is the party that has called for Transcarpathia to become part of Hungary in case Ukraine is to be repartitioned right before the start of the war. And they're gathering quite a bit of sympathy for, for these statements of, well, our free voices are being curtailed. And obviously this is a political party, not citizen journalists, but I think the same trends can be observed elsewhere. Once they start being shut down, it becomes, a reason to legitimize their voices as if they were saying something that was true, that needed to be curtailed.
Thanks, Vlad. Stepping in while the commissioner is dialing back in, and we only have a few minutes left, but looking ahead to tomorrow, Jennifer, we have April Fool's Day by chance. We have the EU-China summit, and both sides are saying that it will focus on different things. What do you expect coming out of that in terms of any Ukraine-related news, because there's a lot of interest, isn't there, in whether or not, what kind of support China is likely to offer?
I mean, well, the very short answer is I don't expect a great deal from the summit, but I do know that from what we've reported today, that European leaders will be under pressure, the heads of the EU institutions, to show that, or to tell China that if they do make a more active move to support Russia, the supply of arms, most obviously, then that would have consequences. Although so far we see no one's willing to spell out what the consequences might be. Just as 2 months ago, nobody wanted to spell out what sanctions Russia might face, and that was all very tightly guarded until they were announced.
Thank you, and welcome back, Commissioner.
Yes, I'm sorry I had to change my computer because we probably spoke so much about the fatigue, so that my computer just out. But I can use my assistant's computer to finalize. We are really out of time, I see. So that's almost the end. I really wanted to thank you all for the work you're doing. As I said, I think this is an extremely important part. People need to know what is happening. People, of course, we have to invest into that critical mindset. It's very unfortunate that not so much of that information reaches Russia. And people in Russia, unfortunately, get a completely different information about what's going on. But my belief that Jennifer touched on Crimea and what happened and reactions after Crimea, I believe that Putin might have similar illusion that something similar what happened with Crimea can happen with the whole Ukraine, where Zelenskyy and his ministers flee the country and they just take and do the sort of referendums and announce all the things that they wanted to put through and install their own government. But they got very deep, and Ukrainians fighting very bravely, and now there is no good way out of it. And this is what scares me the most, because at the end of the day, when you think this war has no purpose at all, what Russia is going to win out of it? Nothing. They're going to only lose, and the question is how much. And then it makes extremely hard for negotiators to agree on to something, because, as I said, when there is no clear purpose of that war, with all those, different theories being thrown in about denazification, demilitarization, NATO borders, biological weapons. I mean, I guess they have 10 more theories which they will throw into the weeks to come. But that's the worst. That at the end you need to agree on something. What is the end game? And there is no good end game. So once again, thank you very much for what you're doing. I hope that there will be no fatigue, and we will do utmost we can to support brave Ukrainian people, because I truly believe that they fight for the Western values, for what we've been building so hard for many years.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for trading places with the journalists and probing them for their views and vice versa. And a really big thank you to Jennifer, Vlad, and Simon for taking the time to share your insights. And last But far from least, thank you to all the participants for your attention, and also to my colleague, Paul and Yuka, for their support behind the scenes. So I just wish you bye for now, and thank you very much.